Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, the North America's first place city. Today, and for the past few weeks, we've been talking about the Pensacola and the war between the states. We exited the last time. We talked about how the war wound down here when the federal officials, federal soldiery and Navy moved in. And Pensacola became, literally a ghost town for the next 3 years. But today, I would like to wind up the story by talking a little bit about this gentleman here. This is the story, of course, of Stephen R. Mallory, a very unique man, a Pensacola adopted son, and the story of what he did in those years as the Secretary of the Navy for the Confederate States of America. Mr. Mallory and Mr. Jefferson Davis, of course, had sat across the aisle from each other in the United States Senate. They were close friends, and Davis tapped Mr. Mallory to become the Secretary of the Navy, taking him instead of another man who was very popular at that time, who might have done an excellent job as well. And of course, he was named Raphael Semmes. Mr. Mallory took the job, recognizing from the beginning that he had several very major problems. Number one, he did not have a corps of officers because there had been no Confederate Navy. Secondly, there was virtually no warship worthy of the name that he could use. Number three, he had no factories to build plating for ironcladding naval vessels, and there was no factory available basically for the construction of the foundry use in making cannon. So he worked very quickly and operated from his position, first of all, in Montgomery and then in Richmond, and of course leaving his family here in Pensacola up until the flight occurred in May of 1862. Now, Mallory was a man of great genius. He had had 10 years experience working with naval warfare and naval vessels. He knew where the shortcomings of the South were as well as the strengths of the North. And so, first of all, he began with what he did call his defense strategy. And for this, they developed a unique weapon that had not been around at that point in time. They called them torpedoes. Today, we would call them mines. And basically, the torpedo or mine of Mallory's vintage was a beer keg, literally, a beer keg which was fitted out, filled with powder, and then had percussion caps set on either end so that any vessel striking them would set off an explosion. Another version was a mine that was literally anchored in a critical point in a harbor, anchored there, and there would be an electric wire sent to it so that by battery a signal could be sent to it and explode the mine. And these mines were they not only used them in the South, but they very, very quietly and secretly used them to cause problems in some of the northern ports, and Mallory was credited, of course, with this. That was the first thing he did. The second thing, of course, the second was to begin looking for war vessels that could be converted to warships that were actually available or under construction. And for this, he turned to Great Britain, where he went about attempting to buy vessels from companies that had ships on the ways almost completed, because Mallory knew he needed these vessels quickly. And one of the very first, of course, that he managed to buy was renamed, and it became the Confederate States vessel Alabama, which was turned over to Raphael Semmes. And of course, the story of the Alabama became one of the highlights of the Southern lore in the war between the states, because the Alabama was a very successful privateer, if you will, sinking a lot of federal shipping and also doing damage to federal warships. She finally was sunk off the coast of France by a federal vessel named the Kearsarge. Raphael Semmes, of course, became a legend as far as naval history in the South. The third thing that Mallory did, of course, was to quickly get into motion factories to make plating and cannon. And he put together factories in Selma, Atlanta, and Richmond, which began to turn out the plate. Now, the first place they used the armor plating was on barges, which were to be placed in the Mississippi River and be anchored there in secure positions and have large cannon on board, so that these vessels would be literally a kind of a siege line to prevent federal vessels from coming either up or down the river to attack New Orleans. And they went ahead and did this, and of course it looked like they were going to be successful, but we'll come back to that in just a moment. The third thing, of course, well, along with the plating, Mallory went forward and took a former commercial vessel called the Virginia and had her plated and properly armed, and she was renamed this time as the Merrimac. And the Merrimac was in Norfolk Harbor, and once she went out with her armor and with her cannon, she was a scourge to the federal shipping that was there, because they could not touch her. The Merrimac was very successful, did damage here, there, and everywhere. And then, without Mallory's knowledge of it, surprisingly, a northern vessel had been constructed with plating as well. She was known as the Monitor, and she had been developed in New York by an inventor, a developer named Erickson. And the Monitor was quickly sent down the coast and went into battle against the Merrimac in a classic battle in which they bounced cannonball off one another all day long, neither one succumbing to it, and they dropped back. And at this point in time, of course, at least this according to Mallory's account, the captain of the Merrimac suddenly believed a lot of rumors about other things that were about to happen to him in that port, and without Mallory's approval, he literally had the vessel scuttled, and that ended the story of the Merrimac. Things could have been very different for the South had that gone differently, but that's the way it went. The third thing that, that Mallory began to work with, of course, was what we would today call a submersible. The idea of a submarine had been around forever. They had talked about it, about the year 1800. Napoleon had experimented with it, and now Mallory's people experimented in two different versions. I won't go into the one because it was totally unsuccessful. But nearby here in Mobile, developers put together a vessel called the Hunley. Now, the Hunley was a cigar-shaped vessel, was long enough to seat 8 men who would operate at cranks. And the cranks, they turned the cranks. The cranks operated a shaft, which in turn turned a propeller. And at the stern was the position of the commander, and he had what we would today call a periscope. So he could look out across the water. This vessel would not go very far underwater, but she would not be sightable, of course, by a vessel she was approaching. And these men would turn the cranks, the propeller would turn, the steersman would bring her up, and the experiments in Mobile were successful. So they took the vessel called the Hunley on a flat car. They took her to Norfolk, put her in the water, and had a test there. Unfortunately, things went wrong, and the vessel sank. But they raised her, they fitted her out again with a new crew, tried it again. The second time was a failure, but they had faith in her. And so the third time, under a Lieutenant John Peavy, the vessel went forward, and sure enough, she was successful. She bombarded and sunk a great federal vessel called the Housatonic, and once again there was panic in the Northern Navy because they thought, how many of these vessels does Mallory have? Well, unfortunately, there were very few opportunities for the vessel to be used, and at that point, and we don't today know quite what happened. But the vessel was taken away. They got out of Norfolk, out into the Atlantic Ocean, and there she sank. And only recently, fairly recent years, the vessel was rediscovered and has been raised, and now people are doing all sorts of research to see what was the Hunley really like. I wish we could say it had a very strong position in the war. It didn't, but nonetheless, it was one of the highlights of Mr. Mallory's career. Meanwhile, of course, he continued to do all sorts of things to try and improve the situation with respect to more ships. And he sent two key men, one of the elements of the early part of the war that almost brought Great Britain into the war. Mallory sent two emissaries named John Slidell and James Mason. They were on their way to Britain to negotiate for more ships. And a federal warship spotted the vessel carrying these two men, and they captured it and took the men back to New York. They were traveling on a vessel called the Trent, and the so-called Trent affair became an international story. The British were inflamed with all of this going on, but only the very quieting effect of Charles Francis Adams, the American ambassador, convinced the British that they probably should not get involved directly, even though they were sympathetic to the South. One other story, of course, that we must tell about our friend Mallory was the story, the effect of what happened when the South retreated from Pensacola and burned the Navy Yard. The federal troops moved in with the capital equipment, put it in place, and had it operational in about 3 months. Meanwhile, Along the Mississippi River, Admiral Farragut moved in with his fleet to attack and try to capture the city of New Orleans. And this is where the barges with the cannon on board became the point of defense, and a considerable battle took place there on just off the shores of New Orleans. And ultimately, Admiral Farragut's fleet prevailed. The barges were battered and sunk, and Farragut fell back, knowing that he had other duties as both a patroller and also to blockade the South. But his ships were damaged, so he limped into Pensacola Bay, and they went to the Navy Yard where the equipment was now usable, and the Farragut's fleet was indeed restored that way. Some months later, that same fleet, of course, made Farragut famous because they made an attack against Fort Morgan in Mobile Bay, and they moved in. This is one of those interesting little stories. I don't know that it's true, but it's always kind of fun to tell it. Every great military commander should have at his side two key people. One, a public relations man who to write good copy, and the other, an editor to be sure that the copy got into print correctly. Well, everyone knows that the story about Admiral Farragut. He moved into Mobile Bay, started moving forward, and immediately these people out there spotted that there were some of these floating mines, these torpedoes that Mr. Mallory had developed. And the story goes that the original copy that the PR man had written didn't have a comma in it. But finally, when the editor had put that comma in there, it made Admiral Farragut look like a true statesman as well as a great military leader, because the way it read was, "Damn the torpedoes, pause, full speed ahead." He hadn't said it exactly that way in the first instance, but that's the way it went down in the history books, and consequently he looked very, very able in doing so. Well, the war went on. Mr. Mallory's devices continued to made part of the support of the Confederate military possible, but of course ultimately the war came to an end. And Mr. Mallory, as it was just approaching its end, the entire cabinet, led by Mr. Davis, fled from Richmond first to Petersburg, and then they fled south. And by the time they reached the city of Abbeville, South Carolina, one of the members, Judah P. Benjamin, who had been the Secretary of the Treasury, left. He was a big man. He could not ride a horse well, and he said he just could not ride any longer. He was left, and as it turned out, this man succeeded in moving south to what we today call Tampa Bay, and took ship and went to Great Britain, where he lived out the rest of his life very comfortably as a lawyer. And there are some who say, well, it may have been that Judah P. Benjamin had some of the remaining Confederate gold in his saddlebags when he went. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but then that's one of the nice little stories that sort of ties to Mallory. The cabinet met for the last time in Abbeville. Then they went to Washington, Georgia. And it was at this point in time that they realized that the game was up. Appomattox had come, and so these men, it was every man for himself, and they departed. And within a matter of days, Stephen Mallory was captured in the little village of LaGrange, Georgia. He was taken off to prison, and for a time, some of the hawks in Washington wanted Mallory and some of the other cabinet officials to be placed on trial for treason, and they wanted to have them hung. But Mr. Andrew Johnson, who had succeeded Mr. Lincoln by now as president, pardoned Mr. Mallory, and he returned to Pensacola, put his own home, he and his wife's home, in order, and ultimately within about 6 months, the whole family returned here. And Mallory, although his civil rights were never restored, he was allowed to practice law, and he went into practice downtown in Pensacola in company with a man named Augustus H. Maxwell. And Mallory lived out his life very successfully, a much respected citizen, until he died in 1873. He is buried in St. Michael's Cemetery, and his burial place is unique because every day, and if the people do the job that they're supposed to, the flags over his gravesite alternate. Federal one day, Confederate the next, and so forth. And his gravesite is a much respected part of the cemetery, and of course he was a major part of Pensacola's story in the Civil War.